Good morning to some of you west of where I am. Good afternoon, just barely, to people in the east coast of the United States, and good evening to our friends in Europe. We are here for another session of the webinar series of the International Land Conservation Network, Connecting Universities with Land Conservation Organizations. I am your host, but the moderator for today's session will be David Foster. I have had the good fortune to work with David now for almost 2 decades, and he is an excellent scholar, author of many books and articles. He also has, for I believe more than 30 years, been the director of the Harvard Forest at Harvard University, and he's a leader both nationally and internationally in the long-term ecological research network community. So David is exceptionally well suited to lead this discussion. I should also note that David is deeply involved in the Wildlands and Woodlands initiative that is affiliated both with the Harvard Forest and Harvard University and the Heisted Foundation, and is deeply concerned with land conservation and the role that universities can play in the conservation of land across New England in particular. So David, with that introduction, I hand the floor to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jim. It's great to see you and great to be here with our guest speakers and with our highly dispersed audience. Today we are going to focus in on the role of academics in advancing land conservation. And this is a topic which I think, as you will come to see as we explore it through our four speakers, is much more complicated, has more depth and many more dimensions than we take for granted. I think it's fairly easy to take a pretty superficial view of the role of academics and their institutions in land conservation. After all, conservation needs to be driven by facts, by science, by analyses that deal with the variation in the land, the way it changes over time and space, the way that the land ecosystems and species all play in terms of their critical role for both the functioning of nature and important benefits that are delivered to society. Now, there are many different types of researchers and scientists scattered around many types of organizations, from federal and state agencies to research centers and think tanks, and even many conservation organizations and land trusts. But the greatest concentration of scientists and researchers, and those with the greatest interdisciplinary breadth, are based at universities. Therefore, there should be a natural dependence and linkage between academia and conservation. But this kind of very straightforward and accepted perspective on the relationship between academia and land conservation misses at least 3 dimensions or aspects of this relationship that our speakers are going to explore today, and I'd encourage you all to join in with in terms of discussion and follow-up questions. I'd like to just briefly lay the stage by touching on these 3 dimensions before introducing the speakers and moving on to the rest of the program. It's through this additional depth that we see benefits accruing on both sides, and we really see the success that can occur from very well-informed and very active land conservation. So the first is actually a breadth of the notion of academia, which goes well beyond that of research. And this is going to be a topic that our last speaker, Marianne Jorgensen, is going to touch on. But in her program, which is called Alpine, the Academics for Land Protection in New England, which is based at the Lincoln Institute, they've identified that there's a robust set of activities that occurs within academia, which can contribute in multiple ways to advancing conservation, both in terms of land protection and understanding the function of our landscapes and ecosystems. The first two, what they call pillars of academia, are faculty and staff together, and then students, undergraduates and graduate students. And these two pillars bring much more than just research capacity. Yes, they do undertake studies, and yes, they do pass those on to land conservationists. But both groups can be activists, they can be advocates, they can volunteer, they can serve on a range of boards, and they can become important local educators, both for land trusts themselves and for the larger population. Beyond those first two pillars of personnel who work in academia, there are the administrations and the institution itself. As leading institutions in local communities and oftentimes an entire state or region, academic institutions can find that advancing their mission is supported greatly by participating in local community organization and community action, such as land protection. And in fact, the conservation of nature and the support of those aspects of nature, which bring benefit both to nature itself and to society, help to support additional parts of the mission of academic institutions. And then finally, a fourth dimension of, or a fourth pillar of academia is the alumni, those people who have come through a college or an institution, a larger university, and then go on into the world, who continue to be involved, either for personal or professional reasons, in support of the advancement of land protection. They can do this in support of the university's mission, in support of faculty and students, or as a personal endeavor of their own. A second large dimension of this relationship between researchers, faculty, and land protection organizations and activities is going to be explored by Melly Wheaton and Nicole Ardoin from Stanford University. And what they show is that it isn't just a simple act of doing research and generating information that's important for land protection. But in order to advance this effectively requires really a true partnership, a partnership between the individuals or the institutions involved on both sides of the equation. Researchers, whether they're students or faculty, come from a very different worldview, a very different institutional framework than land conservationists. And therefore, to do effective research takes a tremendous amount of investment on the part of the researcher to understand the culture of the organization they're working with, to understand the true nature of the challenges that are posed to that organization, and then to develop research which is effective and also can be translated into the type of outreach that is understandable for land conservationists, understandable and applicable for its audiences, and that really make projects move forward. And then that brings me to a final dimension of the role of academics in advancing land protection and furthering conservation more broadly. And that's going to be touched on by Louis Bretons from Barcelona, who's going to display, I think, very effectively that the production of research and the formation of the partnerships that can really develop effectively between academics and land conservation organizations is a two-way street. there is benefit accrued on both sides. It's not simply a production of research results and a handoff, but there's actually a tremendous amount that's contributed both to the individual and to the production of his or her research through that process. So the flow comes not just from academia to conservation, but back. The research is improved by the process. Better data are generated by getting access and information along the way. And the results become more robust and more realistic and more actionable because they've been contributed to both by the researcher themselves and by the organization that they're working with. Meanwhile, academia in general and academic institutions benefit very greatly from this relationship because the real world, the land that these researchers are working with in, the society and the cultural organizations that they're dealing with are as important a space for learning and for education as is any university lecture hall or any large laboratory. So this multidimensional space that is occupied by this very dynamic relationship between academics and conservation is a challenging one to understand, but one that we can explore in great detail, beginning with our first session, which is going to be from two researchers at Stanford University, Nicole Ardoin, who's a senior fellow and associate professor in the Graduate School of Education. And she works within the socioecology lab of the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. And she will then be followed by her coworker, Melly Wheaton, who's a senior research scholar at the same Woods Institute at Stanford. So Nicole, I pass it on to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, David. What a great introduction, and I loved hearing about all those pillars. I feel like you've done a wonderful job. In fact, you've marvelously laid the groundwork for just about everything we've been thinking about. And I also have to say that I am disappointed that we are not. Well, actually, let me see. Let me make sure I've got my video started here. There you go. So you can see that I am unfortunately not in Barcelona today, but I am feeling like I could be because I'm sitting on my back deck here in Palo Alto, and it feels warm and dry, like a Mediterranean climate. So I wish we were all together in person, but it's the next best thing. So we are delighted to be here with you, and I was thrilled to hear David's introduction because I recognize so much of the work that we've been doing in the pillars that David described from Alpine. As mentioned, part of the reason that we got interested in this work in the first place is that Melly and I and the social ecology lab that we run here at Stanford, we are passionate about land conservation. We are passionate about doing work at that nexus of research and practice. And when we started to look around us here in California, for any of you who are familiar with this area, you may know that this is a hotbed for land conservation, and in particular for land trusts. In the United States, there are more than 1,400 land trusts, and it is mind-boggling to recognize that there are more than 56 million acres of land conserved in land trusts across the United States, which is more than all land in national parks combined in the lower 48 states. And in California in particular, there are more than 175 land trusts. In this area, in the Bay Area, we have some very strong land trusts, and many of them are large organizations. In addition to that, there are many small organizations. There are many small land trusts and open space organizations that don't have researchers on staff. And it was motivating for us to think about the opportunity, as was laid out in the introduction, for better utilizing the researchers at our university and partner universities, as well as the students who have this desire to do this connection of research and practice. So our project grew out of several interests here on campus in collaboration with our partner, Professor Deborah Gordon, who's in biology. We first started working on these questions back in 2012. There was an uncommon dialogue, and this would be the next slide. I believe this is Chandani who's, thank you. In collaboration with our partner, Deborah Gordon, and also with support from the Woods Institute for the Environment where we all work, there was an uncommon dialogue that was hosted. And I wish I could take credit for this, but this was actually put on by Deborah and other colleagues who brought together more than 100 partners from around this area to think about how we could better partner with land trusts. And there was a real hunger for thinking about what opportunities existed for doing research with local land trust partners. The interesting thing that came out of this, and you heard a little bit of foreshadowing of this in the pillars, was that while there was great interest and while many land trust and open space managers came to this collaborative dialogue, there were not great boundary space organizations or great ways to continue this collaboration. And so we had people come together for the day, we had small groups and large groups and presentations, and we had discussions about social science, natural science, law and policy and business. And there was tremendous interest in partnerships. But and a couple of collaborations came out of this, but nothing that felt sustained after about 2012. The second part of you see on this slide is that starting in about 2014, we had several researchers from the Haas Center for Public Service who collaborated with students actually from our research lab to put together a practicum and start to say, how about if we start thinking small and we start thinking, could we start to chunk off a few projects that our local land trusts are doing anyway, in their stewardship monitoring projects, in their ongoing work in terms of perhaps building land trusts from the ground up. And these are projects that the students could do as part of a practicum in class. And these are whether they're master's students, whether they're undergraduate students working on summer projects. And this it started out as a practicum where they were truly just very short-term projects. And it quickly grew into a very popular course that has been continuing for the past 4.5 years. And next slide, please. This led us to recognize that, as was mentioned by David, that there were some projects that were tremendously successful, and we had partnerships that lasted over time. There were other projects that had a little bit more difficulty getting off the ground and led to some research questions for us, because as researchers, we're always thinking about those challenges in the world, and we're always thinking about the curiosities. We were always wondering, what were the challenges? Why was it that some partnerships seemed particularly successful? And why is it that others seemed to fall flat? So combining what we had learned from the uncommon dialogue with what we had learned from the class over time, we went to our partners at the Woods Institute and we applied for a grant through the Realizing Environmental Innovation Program. And this is a grant program that allows researchers like us to work with our collaborators in the field to apply for grants that look at these interdisciplinary research and practice projects that have a solutions orientation and that are scalable. And that in particular, it's very important that you have these external stakeholders and partners that really will make a difference in conservation on the ground. Next slide, please. This led to the project that Melly and I have been working on with several of the research associates in our lab, and also with Dr. Deborah Gordon in biology for the past 2.5 years, which is our research and practice, students and land managers collaborating for solutions. This project has 3 pillars to it. One is to engage students and faculty members and staff members to work directly with land managers, primarily in land trusts and open space management collaboratives, on these conservation-focused partnerships on the ground. The second pillar is to develop tools to really help facilitate these partnerships over time, because that was a piece that we could see, at least in our context, was really missing, to have these tools that would allow these partnerships to continue over the longer term. And then the third piece was that curiosity, that research piece from us. So to really look at what were the supports and what were the pieces that were hindering these partnerships from continuing over time. I'll now turn it over to Melly, who will talk about what some of the tools are that we've been developing and what we've learned from doing the research part of it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. As Nicole mentioned, we have 3 main goals for our project, and I'm going to go through those more in depth. And if we, can you go back? There we go, perfect, thank you. So Oh, you can go forward one more. Next slide, perfect, thanks. So the first goal, as Nicole mentioned, is to really engage students and researchers and land managers in these conservation-focused partnerships. And we're really aiming for them to be win-win situations, although as Nicole mentioned, there are definitely challenges, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. And one of the examples of this engaging students, as Nicole mentioned previously, is this open space management practicum. And in this practicum, students partner with land management organizations throughout the San Francisco Bay Area to conduct research projects that are really driven by the organization's needs. And each project works to inform open space management and conservation. And so by the end of the practicum, which in our situation is usually the quarter-long Stanford quarter, although some of these have continued on into multiple quarters, that the land management organization has had a specific need met by the student's work, and then the student has really gained skills and experience in research, stakeholder engagement, policy, and the practical aspects of land and environmental management. Students produce a variety of products and deliverables for the partner organization. So they may do biological monitoring data, they might provide wildlife management plans, visitor surveys and analyses. And in addition to those deliverables, they also produce a final poster and report to the partner. So this slide here specifically shows one of the project topics in which a student worked with a land trust that's operated by an indigenous tribe local to the southern San Francisco Bay Area. And this slide shows the student's poster on the product, and her full report, recommendations and other deliverables went to the partner. So this is just one example of how students are becoming engaged, and Nicole will discuss some more later on. Next slide, please. So the second goal of our project is really to provide tools to support the partnerships. And so as part of this work, we've been creating a website for both Stanford faculty, students, as well as the community land management partners. And as you look at this website, you'll notice across the top there's several headers in red. So you'll see home, Stanford programs, Stanford courses, student projects, and tools for collaboration. And each of those header links to a page of resources that can be used to help initiate partnerships. And I'll briefly explain what's under those headers, and then we'll look at the tools for collaboration more in depth. And so, for example, the Stanford program page, that's a searchable database that contains Stanford affiliated programs that offer an internship or practicum component to it in earth systems, land management, conservation. And some of these experiences are paid so that the students and land trust can benefit from those additional resources. The Stanford course page provides information on the varied Stanford courses in which students can obtain real life experience related to conservation and management. And these often do have they're project-driven courses. And we see this being helpful for land management organizations as well as a point of contact in finding students for research projects. The student project page showcases the variety of different projects students have done and their deliverables in their efforts to partner with the land conservation organizations. And then finally, the tools for collaboration page provides guidelines. And if you want to go ahead and click directly, click on the tools for collaboration red header, and we'll go to see that more in depth. Is it clicking on there yet? There we go. So on the tools for collaboration, we have two different sections, and you can go ahead and click on the land trust guidelines. So what we have here, what we've done is we've generated several different categories of guiding questions for land managers. And then the other one is for university researchers. So these are really questions that are helpful at the beginning of a partnership, right? So before you even start the work, thinking about, what are you involved with? Do you have the same sort of values and vision of what your partner might have? What's your different organization focuses? What is your readiness and the logistics? Do you have the resources to be able to help sustain the partnership? And then also around relationship building, which is really important in terms of the capacity. Do you have those people that can be part of the sustained partnership? And then also, what are the projected outcomes and expectations that you might have? So these are all questions that are just, guideline questions. So they don't necessarily need to be all answered in any specific order, but they're just things to think about before diving into the partnerships. So this one is specifically for the land managers. And then if you click back, there we go. You'll see that there's similar categories for university researchers as well. So the prior partner work, mission of the university, the readiness factors and logistics, relationship building, and projected outcomes and expectations. Okay, next slide, please. So this is another tool we've created to support the partnerships. We created a digital map for visually seeing the location of where some of these partnerships are being conducted. You can go ahead and click on that. And this specific website is focused on the open space management practicum partnerships that have been done, and we're continually adding to that as we go along. And we were finding that it was really helpful to have a different way for students and faculty and for the local land managers to see where within the San Francisco Bay Area are these partnerships really occurring. And it also has a focus on the different type of projects. So we've divided the project into natural science research, social science research, and ecological stewardship research. So each one of those, in the legend on the left, each icon and color represents a different type of project. And this map has also served as the foundation for an undertaking on campus, which has been to really better visualize all the environmentally related university community partnerships across campus. And that's being led by the Stanford's Haas Center for Public Service, which is another on-campus hub for community service and partnerships. Next slide, please. So the third goal of our project is to conduct research on the partnerships. And we have two main research questions that you can see here. What generates effective collaborations between land trusts and academic institutions on research endeavors? And what are the facilitators and our barriers to research-focused collaborations between universities and land trusts? So to gather data, we've been conducting interviews, surveys, observations, informal discussions with various partners and students and faculty to really understand what makes the partnerships work effectively and what are the challenges. And we knew going into this, as we know with a lot of partnership, that two big challenges are time and resources. So we knew those were obviously challenges, but we really wanted to look beyond that and see what are other factors beyond just the time and resource that are important to think about. Next slide, please. So here we have some of initial themes that we've been finding, first around successful partnerships. So the one main theme is around support, and are there boundary organizations and people? So the idea of the boundary person is someone that can be that person that can go between the university and the community partner and really help translate and really also help be an anchor for the project. So when things are, beginning to maybe go astray or people are having a hard time communicating, that organization or person can really be there to help support that. And then along with that is having some sort of resource, having some sort of base resources for that. Another big thing is the trust. So the personal connection and dedicated time, those relationships take a long time to form and a lot of effort to continue the sustained relationships. And then finally, communicating well. So that's communicating around goals, making sure that what's going to be deliverable, what the deliverables are, is communicated well, when that's going to happen. And also a shared linguistic understanding. We know that often in academia, we'll use a really different term than what might be used on the ground and in the field. So making sure that what we're saying is everyone has a shared understanding of that. Next slide, please. And then obviously there are challenges too, to sustaining these partnerships. One of the big ones that we see is power imbalances. So what sort of things are happening either at the university or potentially at the partner organization of how people are feeling, the way that they're seeing their partner that hasn't been discussed. And those underlying or implicit imbalances can really affect the trust that we know is so key to making sure that these partnerships are sustained. Also, and that ties into the erosion and lack of trust, that you have different timescales or unclear expectations and responsibilities, and then potentially a lack of dedication. Another challenge is the lack of support. So not having these boundary organizations and people that are so core to helping be at the foundation of these partnerships and making sure that things stay online, people are able to communicate, people are able to talk about any power differentials. And then miscommunication. So again, if you have a really different language that you're using, so a term you're using in academia is not at all the sort of term that's being used on the field, then there's going to be a lot of misunderstanding there. So these are definite challenges to creating these successful partnerships. And these are the sorts of things that we also are continuing to find in other work that we do around community partnerships with the university. And I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole to give some more a specific example.
Great, thanks, Melly. I will just wrap up with about 1 minute here because I would love to hear from our other colleagues as well. We wanted to end by just highlighting a specific example to give some texture to these broader picture ideas that we've been highlighting. So we wanted to end with giving an example of a multifaceted, multi-partner work that our lab and others have undertaken here on campus for the last 4 or so years. Over the past 4 or so years, students from our lab and other labs on campus, plus a range of classes that we've highlighted here, as well as fellowships through our Haas Center for Public Service, have been working with land trust and open space groups around the region to primarily look at protection in redwood forests, which is, as you can imagine, has been a big point of discussion here on the peninsula in the Bay Area. So for example, some of the groups that we've partnered with have included the Mid-Peninsula Open Space Trust, the Peninsula Open Space Trust, Grassroots Ecology, and Actera, which are friends groups that work directly with the Open Space Trust groups. Also Save the Redwoods, which is a collaborative organization that works across all of the trust organizations. And also others, including Save the Redwoods League and Sempervirens. And we've had students who have worked in all these different organizations, as well as faculty members who have done projects that have included social science projects, baseline documentation, ongoing stewardship monitoring, education, volunteer management, interpretive planning, and so on. These have occurred through the open space course that we've described earlier, interviewing courses, GIS classes that are more really focused on skills-based development for the students. Also, of course, biological courses and geology and things that might be more typical that you might expect. We've also worked with law and policy courses on some of the documentation pieces. And then finally with some of our business school students, because there certainly is a lot of business planning that goes into it. One of the pieces that's been successful, and that you heard from Melly talking about some of the successes that we've had, has been this idea of having a couple of overarching labs and then also this partnership with a center on campus so that we're able to have these relationships that occur over time. certainly one of the challenges is always that these relationships with the organizations and on campus do take a lot of time and care. And certainly also on the organizational side as well, when you have turnover in nonprofit organizations or in these trusts or on the ground, it always takes time to rebuild those relationships, and recognizing that we don't want to put too much pressure on our colleagues when they have a lot going on the ground. So I think that I'll end there for now, but we're certainly happy to answer questions during the Q&A period about what's worked well and how we've been able to keep these relationships going over time without being burdensome to our partners. I'm also looking forward to hearing about our other colleagues today, talking about the research piece, because that's been the piece we've been building in over time as well. So thanks so much for your time today, and we look forward to engaging further in questions and conversations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicole and Mele. The beauty of today's sets of presentations is that each of the groups is coming from a different place within this set of relationships between academia and land conservation. We've just heard from two speakers who work to facilitate this in a variety of ways and work within an academic institution to further the role of its students and its faculty collaborating in conservation. We now actually switch and perspectives and encounter an individual, Louise Brotons, who's a scientist and researcher at the Research Center for Ecological and Forestry Applications in Barcelona, who actually conducts research and can give us a perspective from the ground with a foot both in the outdoor laboratory and within the university on his relationship and his activities working within the broad sphere of conservation biology and its application to management, stewardship, and land protection. Louise.
Thanks, David. It's a pleasure to be here. First, thank you also for the introduction that you made at the beginning. I think sets the scene very well. Thanks also to the organizers for providing me this opportunity to explain some of the things we have been working on. I'm a research scientist in an ecological and forestry research institute, so I work mostly on research. But when I received a bit this kind of a request of explaining my experiences, I was at the beginning thinking what I'm going to explain, my experience. Maybe it's not very interesting, but as I was like trying to grasp on the history of that experience, I started to realize that actually there were a lot of details and patterns in that process that might be interesting for some of you, especially after listening what the previous speaker has explained. Just briefly, my research, I'm a landscape ecologist, so I mostly deal with what are the responses of species and communities to landscape changes. So I work at that scale, dealing with disturbances like fire, climate change, land abandonment, forestry, how those drivers of change affect changes in space and time of those species. I've been working mostly on Mediterranean systems, but I've been doing some research in other areas like Northern Europe or in Canada as well. So I have a broad experience on that. And my experience in linking with land conservation organizations and NGOs in general revolves around information, about the role of information. I think that's my key discussion today, my key element where I want to focus about how to get the right information to inform decisions and from land conservation, but decisions in general, and how to derive that information in the right way. And I think researchers have a role there. So my starting point is like, as a researcher, usually you need data. You just go to the field, you collect your data, but in many cases, especially if you work at the landscape scale, data it's expensive and difficult to collect. So every time more you rely on citizen science information. So and that was one of my first links actually to the starting point of this history, because we contacted with some organizations, NGOs, ornithological organizations in Catalonia that actually collecting a lot of information. And I applied the general approach to this from a researcher that requires data, needs data. So I contacted the people coordinating those monitoring programs and collecting data in the field. Because at that point, what we wanted to do is to develop some models to actually calculate and estimate the spatial distribution of different species in the area. So we required data. We had more like research-oriented questions, and we're not very interested in how treated the information we were providing or we were calculating would serve for other purposes. So we got that information and we start like conducting some of the models. But actually, after this this initial link developed, the people in the organization, in this NGO, running monitoring programs linked to the natural conservation network in Catalonia, actually was very interested in seeing and commenting on the maps we were producing. And actually, little by little, actually what developed is that we were very interested also in the details that they value, that we were not at the beginning just like concentrating on maybe mathematical values, etc. We're not paying attention to. And that developed in a kind of a association that grew in intensity and linkages. And from that, actually, this the provision of those methods actually, and the discussions with the NGOs actually ended up in identifying very carefully what are the products derived from those methods and that data that would be interesting for the institutions. And since that institution actually was very linked to the natural network of conservation organization and administration, actually the products that we started to develop were starting to fit into conservation and prioritization programs all around the country. So actually what started from more a kind of unidirectional interest from the research part ended up actually more a bidirectional partnership in which we collected, or we were using their data for research purposes and modeling, but actually we were giving back those all those models that allowed to have a special explicit information on detailed scales for different conservation prioritization programs or exercises. And that has been growing in nature. And that's been going on now for like more than 15 years, this collaboration. And now we're working more and more with the conservation networks in Catalonia to integrate all these maps and try to identify priority areas for both management and protection at the regional level. So that's been quite a success. What we are following now, so this is kind of this thing that's been growing actually, and required, as the previous speaker also identified, a lot of time and trust, and that's a bit difficult, and an investment of time and trust, but with a lot of potential benefits at the two level that has been like feeding the process during the last years. Actually, is now continuing at two different scales. So actually, this is growing. So the first is this kind of overflown from the initial focus on birds, and because the organizations we were working with were working mostly on birds, to other groups, so working with other NGOs, actually collecting data from other taxa and feeding those informations to the planning activities and programs. And the other one is kind of it's been like the scaling up towards Europe actually. So we are working, so we are working in networks of NGOs around Europe. This is mostly focused on birds in this time, but it's also like expanding to other taxa, in which actually we are integrating all the information from Europe, modeling that information, and then feeding that information directly into different processes of decision making, both from NGOs but also from administrations, public administrations. And again, this is like a very slow process. That's, I think, one of the main challenges of all these linkages between research and land conservation organizations and NGOs. It's that it just doesn't pop up. It doesn't go and it's there. So you need to nurture. You need to take care of. And if you do that, then that's growing. I want to say that also, just to finish this this initial presentation, is that actually from our research organization, CREAF, and a partner organization we're working on, the CTFC, also focusing on forestry. Actually now we are trying to collaborate with all these, with natural conservation organizations in terms of going further and just integrating into the information part, into the methodology, into focusing a bit more every time more on the communication part of that information together with organizations. I think that the communication part is very important. It's quite relevant to how to interpret the research that you are delivering, that you are producing, and when the nice thing is that when you work together with a natural conservation organization or an NGO, and the context is very clear, you need to explain much better what is the impact of that information you are generating. And so there are new partnerships going on now in trying to work together with communication officers, researchers, and NGO partners to work together on these different lines. And this is, I think, it's a promising element also to build on. And I will go later on the probably more on the positive sides, on the constraints, and the added value. But I think that the take-home message here now is that actually the association, the partnership that developed between us and the organizations that we've been working with has been a win-win. And I think that this identifying very clearly what are the elements behind the win-win situation. It's very important to maintain that collaboration in time, because the partnerships will require investment and effort, and without this win-win, without these rewards, it's going to be very difficult to maintain that in time. So I think I will leave it here for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Luis. That was a fascinating perspective of kind of the organic development of a relationship. Like many researchers like myself, you entered into this first encounter and this first work in a very typically naive way that a scientist would, and have laid out a really great story of how both you and the research and the organizations have benefited by the enduring and rich relationship that's developed. Thanks very much for that.
David, this is Jim Levitt. Can I intervene for just a second?
Yes.
I just want to remind all the listeners that after the presentations, we're going to take questions for all three of the sets of speakers. So please feel free to use the question box represented by the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen when you move your cursor over the bottom of the screen. And let's stack up some questions that I can deliver to the panelists after our next presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Yes, I have a couple of questions that I will lead off with, but it'll be a much richer discussion if we can engage our audience in generating some additional questions. So for our final presentation, we turn to a very different endeavor, one that's analogous in its interest in advancing the collaboration between academics and land protection and broader conservation. But this is an endeavor that's led by Marianne Jorgensen, presenting today as the coordinator for Alpine, Academics for Land Protection in New England, which is based at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, where Marianne works with Jim Levitt, who is hosting the webinar series. Marianne will lay out really an attempt at a regional scale to advance the kinds of relationships and the kinds of activities that our two previous presenters have talked about in more detail. So Marianne, we welcome you.
Thank you so much, David. And I want to say hello to everybody and thank you for joining us for this presentation. I share Nicole's disappointment that we're not all sitting in Barcelona, but hopefully we will sometime in the future. As you know, I work as the coordinator for an organization that's called Academics for Land Protection in New England, or ALPINE is the acronym. And we are a network of academic institutions that are located in New England with the goal of advancing land protection in that region, nationally and globally. We started the network in New England, in the New England states, because we wanted to start on a smaller scale. The aim was to get the network active and successful regionally and then expand nationally later. Although New England is small in area in relation to the rest of the US, the reach actually of the network is large because there's significant numbers of colleges and universities in New England that have numbers of students, faculty, and alumni. New England has a large number of colleges that are diverse in size and focus, both large public institutions as well as many smaller private colleges. And many of the schools own a large amount of land themselves. So the organization's mission is to encourage the faculty, students, administration, staff, and alumni of these institutions across New England to become significantly engaged in the conservation of land across the region. There are many institutions working very hard to advance land conservation on their campuses through teaching, research, working with land trusts, conserving land, and engaging students. And we thought it would be beneficial to learn from each other and to share the resources to make a larger impact. Next slide, please. And so I think it's beneficial, Jim had touched on this Wildlands and Woodland vision. So the idea for Alpine came out of this report written by 30 scholars from institutions across New England that outlined a vision for the forests of New England, and they called that the Wildlands and Woodlands vision. The Wildlands and Woodlands vision calls for an unparalleled long-term conservation effort. The authors reported that forest cover was now being lost in every New England state. And so they set a regional target by calling for a doubling of the pace of conservation to permanently protect 70% of New England in managed forests and wildlands by 2060. This scale of conservation, according to the authors, would retain and enhance the many benefits that forests currently provide, including clean air and water, tourism and recreation, and an array of forest products. They concluded that it will take an initiative from all sectors, including the public, private, civic, and academic sector, to address these immense environmental challenges we face, including climate change and landscape fragmentation. They realized that academic institutions in New England, where much of the theory and practice of conservation and environmental protection emerged in the United States historically, has a great deal to offer in addressing these challenges. To tap the energy and initiative of colleges and universities and research stations across the region, the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative, based at the Harvard Forest and supported in part by the Highstead Foundation and the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, inspired the creation of Alpine. Next slide, please. So these scholars, as they were talking and writing this report and putting together this vision, they discovered that, or they realized that they all were doing a lot involving land conservation, but didn't know what each other were doing. And even at individual schools, faculty, administration, students didn't know what each other were doing. So that there was a real need to be more focused, learn from each other, learn what each other was doing, highlight best practices, share research, curriculum, project ideas, and this could inspire others to get more involved with land conservation. So in Alpine, we began to develop strategies and goals for these four, as we identified, four constituents, or as David spoke about, pillars in academia, realizing that each one of these would have different goals. And so just to talk about it a little bit, so we identified students' goals as educating and training students to increase awareness and importance of land protection, increase active participation by students in land protection through projects, research, and internships, and develop future leaders and career paths in the field. For faculty, we identified the goals as increasing knowledge and teaching of land conservation by faculty, increasing collaboration between faculty and land conservation organizations, focusing research efforts having to do with land conservation, and developing advocates or champions on campuses to promote land conservation. Working with administration and alumni, we identified that engaging with administrators to increase their awareness of the importance of land conservation to the institution and to the community that they're part of had for a multitude of benefits for the university, including obviously mitigation of climate change, clean water, carbon offsets, and the health of their students. The increasing importance of these issues to students, and when they are looking for schools, you know, they are increasingly looking at schools that are making progress in these areas. So it becomes an important issue for them for admission. To incorporate land protection and stewardship into the mission of the institution, and to advance land conservation efforts in their communities and their regions for those reasons we talked about. And then with regional conservation partnerships, the goals that we had, and this is to facilitate that collaboration between land conservation organizations and academics. So those goals are to engage students, faculty, staff, administrators, and alumni in the activities of land trusts and regional conservation partnerships. And just to go back and explain a little bit about regional conservation partnerships, or as we call them, RCPs, which also came out of the Wildlands and Woodlands vision. And there are collaborations among existing land trusts and a variety of other partners, including municipal, state, federal agencies, academic institutions, conservation organizations, and others, to promote longer-term collaborations, realizing that everyone can be more effective when they are working together to achieve land protections of whole landscapes based on shared strategic and long-term conservation priorities. There's currently 46 RCPs across New England, and the network is continuing to grow. So some of the specific projects and next slide, sorry. Some of the specific projects and programs that Alpine has initiated for students is the Summer Institute, which we've run for the last 4 years. Every summer, we bring a group of both graduate and undergraduate students that are working for the summer on a summer-long internship with different land trusts. We bring them together for 2 weekends to different locations where they learn about large landscape conservation efforts. They hear from and network with leaders and practitioners in the field, and they develop leadership skills and explore career options. Another thing we are doing on the Alpine website, we have a job board where students can look for internships and jobs in land conservation. We also work with the Harvard College Conservation Society, which is an undergraduate organization at Harvard University focused on conservation issues, and they host, and we host with them, an annual Careers in Conservation Conference where students have the opportunity to learn about careers and job opportunities. And then our most recent project is developing a network of student organizations at colleges and universities that are focused and concerned about land protection and connecting students to their local natural places. We've been working with a group from Middlebury College up in Vermont in developing a toolkit we just published on how to start a group at a college. We hope in the future to have a network of student groups that will hold, and Alpine will help them hold, annual conferences so that they can learn from each other, advocate for the importance of natural places as a group, and explore career paths. Next slide. One of Alpine's goals, as we said, was to get more faculty to teach aspects of land conservation. And to facilitate this, we are developing educational tools for faculty to use. An example is Paul Catanzaro, who's a professor that teaches land conservation at the University of Massachusetts, has developed a module that can be used by faculty in the classroom. Faculty can use the module directly or can incorporate aspects of it into their own teaching. Other faculty that are teaching land conservation have shared their syllabi on the Alpine website. So again, others can learn from these. We want to facilitate also faculty to work with land trusts by doing research, by organizing student projects, by creating internships, mapping and GIS assistance, and sharing their expertise with the land conservation community, as other presenters have talked about. Next slide. One example of these projects was developed by researchers at the Harvard Forest, and that is the New England Landscape Futures Project, where they're developing and analyzing a set of alternative landscape futures for New England by creating plausible scenarios for the future of land cover for New England. They model out land use scenarios for forests, farmland, and developed land based on stakeholder views. And these are being used to inform real-world decisions about forest management, land use planning, green and gray infrastructure investment, and conservation priority setting. Next slide, please. Again, one of Alpine's main goals is to provide institution members with valuable resources, toolkits, case studies that demonstrate best practices and promote land protection at institutions, including their own lands and lands in their community and region. There are many schools in New England that have conserved their own lands or been involved in conservation in their region. And we thought it would be Alpine believes that it's beneficial to share in the process, the justification, and the methods that schools have used in doing this. And we hope that will help other schools in making conservation a priority. One of the ways we share these examples is with case studies on our website. And we also have an annual Alpine meeting where all members are invited to come once a year, and these issues are highlighted and discussed at those meetings. Alpine's also initiated the Charles H.W. Foster Award for exemplary academic leadership to celebrate institutions and their work as leaders in land conservation and to inspire others to make an impact on conservation. Alpine has awarded 2 schools so far, Middlebury College in 2016, in recognition of the protection of its 2,100-acre Breadloaf campus in Vermont, and at the University of Massachusetts in 2019 for its many contributions to conservation, its faculty, its extension efforts, and the many alumni that work in the field, and especially its role in bringing people together to protect special places. Alpine also has engaged with alumni who are interested in what colleges are doing around land conservation issues, as well as learning more about it for their own lands. We've worked with the Harvard alumni groups, bringing them out into nature for a weekend, and where they learn more about land conservation issues and also about what the university is doing on its own lands. And they are really very successful and very popular. We've also been working with some universities to explore the possibilities of working with land trusts to conserve land in exchange for carbon credits, as more schools are trying to reach carbon neutrality. Next slide, please. And so again, we talked about, we want to encourage colleges and universities to be involved with and actively work with land trusts and these regional conservation partnerships. One way to do this is to involve universities in large landscape initiatives, such as the Northern Appalachian Trail Landscape Partnership and the Long Island Sound Watershed. These are larger multi-state initiatives, and by working together and with academic institutions working with them, it enables them to get larger grant funding, have more research opportunities, and other collaborations. Another thing we've been doing, and my fellow presenters have been touched upon that, is that we've, in talking to both land trusts and faculty when we first started Alpine and interviewing many of them, we saw that a real challenge or a way that they were not involved with each other is they found it difficult to navigate and find each other out. They just didn't know each other. So we would talk to land trusts and they said, universities are too complicated. Who am I going to be in touch with? And then faculty said, I have no idea who the land trust people are. I can't talk to them. So we found that there was a need to bring the two together. So we did have done 2 of these where we have a half a day or spend a whole day together, bringing land conservation professionals and academics, faculty, and administrators together to talk about what they're doing, how they'd like to work, and how they could collaborate together on projects. And those have been really successful, and we plan on doing more of those because there's clearly a need for that. Next slide, please. Yes, so in conclusion, as we look to the future for Alpine, we plan on engaging with institutions beyond New England. We'll begin slowly with individual universities that we think have some real key innovation in land conservation. We've already begun to find ways to collaborate with these schools. The goal is for the Alpine network to benefit from learning about projects that they're doing and initiatives, and then for these universities beyond New England to learn from what Alpine is doing. For example, we're currently working with Duke and Clarkson University to look at how they can work with land trusts to get these carbon offset credits by conserving land. We think this has a lot of potential and will be important to other schools to see the model of in the future. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
David, it's up to you to ask the first set of questions, and then I'll jump in.
Right. Thanks very much, Jim. I see that there are some questions coming in from our audience, and so why don't I ask a few, and in the meanwhile, more can assemble, and we will then turn to those. Well, this is really great to have this suite of perspectives, and I guess my follow-ups really want to get at the heart of the relationships, the heart of what can be accomplished and what is really being accomplished, and to look at that from the perspective of the 3 different groups who we've had representing this activity today. So I wanted to start first by talking to Nicole and Melly from their university base and ask them, we've heard that these relationships, to be effective, need to be genuine, they need to be long-term, they need to be solid, and they need to be rewarding on all sides. And I guess the question is, from a university environment, where do you see, I'd be really curious to understand where you see the support for, the initiative for this kind of work originating. Does it always center in the individual? Does it lie at departments, larger university level? How do you get a sense for that at Stanford and perhaps more broadly?
I'm happy to answer briefly, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Melly to give a longer response. And then also, unfortunately, after this, I have to pop off because I'm going to teach a class right now. But yeah, I would say that we've been fortunate at Stanford. We actually have it built into our university's mission. From the founding mission of the university is to engage with the community. And so from the late 1800s, it's been a part of what the university has been committed to doing. And we've also then, over the last couple of years, been re-engaging in a strategic planning process. And so as part of that, there has been a renewal of this commitment to engaging with the community. And so, as we mentioned, there are a couple of different campus-wide centers. So the Woods Institute, where we work, and then the Haas Center for Public Service, the John Gardner Center for Youth in Their Communities, the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. So various places like that that provide support around campus that allow us to have these partnerships. But I think like anywhere, not to be a Pollyanna about it, I think like any university, and I think like we've heard from Marianne and Luis, there are constant challenges as to that kind of tension between finding time, especially I think for researchers, as to how you can make these partnerships fruitful on both sides, even when there are these facilitating institutions.
Great. And Melly, do you want to add to that?
I would just say that, there are this, as Nicole alluded to, the long-term range planning to really focus more on the local partnerships. And so that's something that is exciting, is to really understand better what's happening within our region, within the San Francisco Bay Area. As we know, there's lots of activity there, and there's lots of concerns. And I think also, you know, as you asked in terms of, is it the individual or center, it's really both that's occurring, right? You have these pushes by, for example, the Haas Center for Public Service that really wants to create these service learning opportunities for students and faculty. And then you also have places like the Woods Institute that is actually providing support and funding to help make the research come into fruition and make these partnerships really excel and have pushed that next stage of the research into the field. So then you have the individual faculty members or students who might really drive that. So it's a combination, and I think at this point it's really thinking about how do we pull all of that together, and that's part of this project as well, is how do we think about all these different entities at the university, which multiple centers and faculty. And one of our efforts right now is to do a survey among all the faculty on campus to really see who is engaging in all this sort of work. And it might be people that we haven't thought about. Maybe there's someone in arts and humanity that are interested in doing this sort of work in a different way. And so we really want to pull all those pieces together at this point.
Great. Well, I think the Pollyanna point is an important one. It's very easy for all of us to present all of the successful endeavors, the end results of a lot of work, but admittedly, there are a lot of challenges along the way and a lot of projects and activities that aren't successful that we learn from. Louise, you mentioned a number of ways that your work benefited from these relationships. I was wondering, both for you to go into a little bit more granular detail, but also to share whether or not this is a general feeling among your colleagues at your institute and more broadly, within even actually your research teams in the field, or is this something that's really much more individual and centered in you as a single researcher?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, because I think that initially it's been something, especially the example I explained, something that it's quite came from my relationship, even personal relationship with organization at the beginning. So that's those kind of facilitators actually help. But it's true that broadly speaking, I think that the feeling that researchers in our institution, but very general in academia and discussions I have with people, is that they are interested because they are valued by their research to have an impact on real life, like and collaboration with NGOs, with administrations, with real problems. But actually, it's not a real, they are not really valuing that part, because actually later on they are evaluated by their articles, by other kind of indicators. So actually, the efforts or investments that they do in these collaborations, they are not always fit. So usually they are very personal commitments, like mine at the beginning. It's true that in my case, actually, that at the end that has delivered also research impact and research outputs, but after a long initial investment. And this effort is very important. I think that the effort required to make these kind of partnerships to work, it's very important to have in mind. And I'm very happy to hear Mele and Marianne and Nicole, and because probably we need more facilitators, more research, more this kind of intermediate, so that this information and these efforts are actually are a bit like weaker, or it's easier to go over those. And I think I want to highlight one last point in related to the effort, and from the perspective of researchers, is that actually my experience working with natural organizations and NGOs is that details matter, and that and very often for researchers, details are not so important, or in any case, a very different kind of details. So when you start discussing or working with collaboration or working with NGOs and natural conservation organizations, you need to make an effort to understand those details. And it's not only as well, but it's not only a question of language. It's a question of what matters to each of the people and the walls. And this dealing with details increases the effort by researchers. So I think there is a lot of hurdles here that need to be dealt with, and this kind of facilitators really are a way forward. And I guess they need to take a lot of ways and forms.
Okay, let me, before we turn to the questions from the viewers, let me just turn to Marianne and say you have worked, one of the ways that you have worked is by having meetings where you bring these groups together. And some of those, you've talked about the success that emerges from that. Where do you see the real challenges in simply getting the people to those meetings? What is distressing or what is challenging to you in terms of attracting the academics and attracting the conservationists?
Yeah, good question. So a couple of things. I mean, I think particularly for faculty, they are overworked anyway. They have a lot of obligations that they have to meet in terms of teaching requirements and research and all those things. So time, that resource is particularly challenging for them. While we do see universities like Stanford that really value working with community partners, there are an awful lot of schools that don't do that. And so there is really no reward for a faculty member other than their own passionate feeling about it to be working outside of teaching and their research. So that's definitely a challenge for these. And then for the land trust organizations, I think on the other hand, again, we've talked so often about this level of trust, the language as Luis just spoke about, you know, how relevant that faculty members can make their work to land trusts. And so there's got to be a little bit of a give between those two, because it's intimidating for many land trusts, I would say, to be working with a faculty member in a particular area of research. Land trusts are usually not resource rich. They have a limited amount of staff, again, that can do a limited amount of things. And so they also have these challenges to work with. But when you put them both together and you feel that energy in the room, it's very encouraging. I think that these things can be overcome by efforts on Alpine, you know, like a network like Alpine and others to do that. The encouraging thing I see is, again, faculty are motivated. The really exciting thing is that students are motivated by this. So the faculty are actually being pushed by students to get involved, to get more experiential learning from the classroom, and that they can get out and really understand real world problems and how to tackle those. So that's also encouraging.
Right, that is a very encouraging aspect of all this. Well, as a researcher, the one comment I would say is that very frequently I get a response that many groups actually don't see that our work is relevant to what they do. And that keeps them from coming to us. So it is important for us to show that relevance. Jim, why don't I turn things over to you and let you pick from questions among the audience responses and continue this discussion.
All right. I just want to begin by complimenting all the presenters. These were really interesting and substantive presentations, and they really enriched this ILCN, International Land Conservation Network, ELCN, European Land Conservation Network, dialogue on all the ways that we can work on conservation. So thank you so much for your contributions. I also want to point to one resource that I did not point to at the beginning. I don't know, Chani, if the slides are up, but if you could dial us back to the Conservation Catalyst book for just a second. We had a chance to look at some of these questions almost 10 years ago now and think particularly over the long term, how can universities and land conservation organizations of all types, including land trusts, collaborate to really have large-scale impacts. And I want to recommend to those of you interested at least 2 case studies in there that point to really substantial long-term impacts. One is the story of the University of Montana's collaboration with the Crown of the Continent effort to protect land in the United States and Canada across the border from Montana, which has been going on now for almost 40 years and has protected a very wide and critical part of the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. So that's one story that's particularly interesting. Another that David modestly did not point to would be the Tully Initiative and the whole North Quabbin Initiative that surrounds the Harvard Forest, which over the last 30 years or so, 25 years, has protected a very substantial chunk of north central Massachusetts. And it's really that interaction between the universities and their allies in land protection out in the community that have produced these lasting impacts on the map and in the landscape. And I know that Stanford's doing the same thing as part of the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve and many other collaborations that are really having a big impact over the long term. So I have a number of questions. I want to point first to the question from Robert Hatch. He said that in Nicole and Melly's presentation, the topic of support was brought up in the vein of gaining professional support when projects stumble. From a practical viewpoint, a huge problem that local land conservation people face is convincing the naysayers that conserving land is a good thing. Real help is needed here. This is a roadblock that organizations such as the Open Space Committees constantly face. The professional support needs to be readily available. And I actually want to direct this question to David and have you, David, mention Jonathan Thompson and Kate Sims' work on the economic impacts of land conservation that's coming out of the Harvard Forest and the importance that has to convince the naysayers that this is a pretty good thing.
Well, let me quickly answer and turn things over to Nicole and Melly. You know, I think one of the things that I've learned as an academic, and I think we can all come to appreciate when we get into these relationships, is that the questions that the practitioners bring to us are equally important and oftentimes more important than the questions that we formulate on our own. And even though they have a lot of direct application, underlying all of them is an awful lot of basic research, basic questions that get at theory and relationships. This particular project that you're talking about is really looking at the economics of land protection and what the consequences are to local communities and to the region of having conserved land. How does it affect things that the towns and communities care about? How does it affect jobs and job growth? How does it affect the cost of land and houses? How does it affect local tax rates? These are fundamental questions that every land trust, every conservation organization must grapple with, every community must grapple with. And there's an awful lot of hearsay and an awful lot of ad hoc information that's available. And what Kate Sims at Amherst College and Jonathan Thompson at Harvard University have done is to pull together a research group with other collaborators that is actually focusing in on these are basic relationships that need to be answered that have much practical impact.
Great. Melly, do you want to add a response to that question?
Yeah, sure. So we're fortunate in the Bay Area that we do have a lot of open space organizations and districts, and there is a lot of collaborative work between those and the land trusts. And we have a open space council that operates that has a wide variety of members as part of that. And so that is a big effort, is how do we, how do we really communicate these important efforts. I think in the Bay Area, there is a lot of sense of, yes, people want their open space. People want to be able to get out of their, you know, their Silicon Valley and be able to go and enjoy those places and be able to conserve it. And so there is, you know, there's a lot of support for that here. I will also say that there has been one of the projects that was done in the open space management practicum where the students actually worked with the indigenous tribe that I mentioned earlier. And they went out to survey what are people's values and attitudes towards conservation and the efforts that this tribe is doing, because the tribe is recognized by the state but not recognized federally, and that impacts a lot of their you know, their ability to get resources and around the land. And so that is part of the efforts of some of the students is what are people's, you know, what are people's values and attitudes towards these open space efforts. And then being able to use that information and to help support the land trust, and how do we do more effective messaging? How do we get out to people around needing this conservation?
And Luis, let me ask of you the same thing. Is there practical support in terms of, say, fire management or guarding against flooding that you all can provide to the local communities in Catalonia that they wouldn't be able to find elsewhere? And do you see that as professional support?
Well, it's difficult. There is no such like facilitators at that level. So usually it's like I explained. So there are like the linkages to organizations, to land organizations or fire organizations in general. It's more personal. But as I mentioned also earlier, what we are start to work on is in the communication part, in facilitating this spread of information from the research part, so that facilitating this first hurdle of where is the information, what are we doing that it's maybe what I'm doing is not relevant for fire management or for conservation prioritization, but maybe what it's doing, what we are doing next door it is. So we have a project at CREAF now, actually, working together not only with CREAF, but with other research organizations and universities, and you need to want to be into that project, so that the objective of that whole project, which is called Prismatic, is to actually facilitate the flow of the information from the research paper and the research to the application, to the real application.
Okay.
And so there is a work by professionals, by communication officers, of actually working with the researchers to make these first digestions and put that in a common repository. So it's not everything, but that's helping this objective that you are kind of asking, because then land managers and land organizations have this information available. Maybe for many of the users, that's enough. That information there is enough. But otherwise, if they want to get a bit more an expansion of on that process, on that method, or that information, they can contact the persons. But we have this team that actually gets there in the middle of the process. So that's starting to be quite useful, actually.
It just goes to show that we have just begun to scratch the surface of how research and work with practitioners can actually improve conditions in the field for conservation. So I want to say that it's 90 minutes past when we started, and that was what we promised you. So I have succeeded in answering 1 out of 11 questions, or getting 1 out of 11 questions answered. I am delighted that the curiosity of this group is so active, and I just encourage you, if you can, to directly talk to some of these people who have been presenting today. They're all on the internet, they're all accessible, and I think that they can help you. I just want to close with a comment from one of your colleagues, Elizabeth Hammond Infield, who works at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and who is actually working right now on a practical project bringing land trusts together with the Appalachian Trail in New England to protect land around the Appalachian Trail. She simply says, "Dear presenters, this was really well done. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives." I second that. I wish you all a good afternoon or evening. And I very much hope that all of us can get together again in Barcelona next spring for the International Land Conservation meeting that is planned to occur there. So good afternoon and thank you very much. Bye-bye.